I'm Drew Grada, returning to further our discussion on circuit breakers. In the earlier session, we discussed the fundamentals of circuit breakers, thermomagnetic properties, interrupting capacity, interrupting rating, voltage rating, and so forth. Now we're going to go into a discussion of the proper application of circuit breakers with specific emphasis on what we call classified breakers. Now we've all heard the joke when people are talking about classified information, and I can tell you about it, but I have to shoot you. Well, in this case, classified breakers has nothing to do with security, unless if you're looking at your family security and safety in your home. So I can tell you about it, and no, I don't have to shoot you. What's the issue? Can I take a circuit breaker manufactured by company X, whether it be Square D or GE or Siemens or Cutler-Hammer or whoever, and install that breaker legally under the sense of in compliance with the National Electrical Code, which is not a legal document in that sense unless it's been adopted by your jurisdiction as a legal entity, the code. Can I install that brand X breaker in a brand Y panel board? Well, and it's not a simple answer. In some cases, the answer is yes. In some cases, the answer is no. In some cases, the answer is maybe. In some cases, the answer is sometimes. So if this is as clear as mud, believe me, it is a very complicated subject. It doesn't have to be quite as complicated as a lot of people make it out to be. As a result, there is some light at the tunnel, but you don't have to think about getting run over by a train in the process. When to use and when not to use classified circuit breakers and some of the other rules that are in the National Electrical Code. I'm going to use two examples from personal experience. The first example is a sports bar that I was called to do some electrical work, and at that sports bar I was presented with a 42 circuit panel board that had 63 operating branch circuit breakers and branch circuits, well, breakers as well. And there were a variety of brands of breakers installed in this panel board. And I'll tell you up front, none of them were in compliance with the code. The second example is more recent. An HVAC technician replaced a 2-pole circuit breaker in the home of a friend. The breaker apparently had suffered some sort of failure. Air conditioner quit working. Air conditioning mechanic came out and repaired it. And in the process, he installed a different brand of breaker in the panel board than what was the brand required. The National Electrical Code, edition of 2014, abbreviated as the NEC. The two overriding articles here have to do with what you can do and what you cannot do in a general sense. The first is Article 110.2, approvals. The authority having jurisdiction, or the AHJ, typically your code inspector in the jurisdiction in which you are licensed to work, must approve all conductors and equipment. Now that individual, the AHJ, can make variances to the code, can disapprove something the code says should otherwise be authorized, can approve an application that the code might otherwise not really authorize, but if the inspector insists that it's perfectly legal, then you're allowed to do it. The second one is Article 110.3, specifically subparagraph B in that article, which states that equipment must be installed and used in accordance with any instructions included in the listing or labeling requirements. So inside the cover of every panel board, there is typically a paragraph or two, some sort of description that says what you can do, what you cannot do with that panel board in terms of the types of breakers you can install, the quantities of breakers you can install, and so forth. And so the code requires that you must comply with those listing and labeling instructions. There's some different arguments around about what we call classified breakers and whether they really comply with this paragraph. However, one of the other paragraphs I haven't quoted here says that if something is listed or labeled by an appropriate agency, then it may be legal for use. And in all cases, classified breakers are UL listed for their application, even though some panel board manufacturers may insist that you can't use them in their panel. The first example, the 42 circuit panel board with 63 operating branch circuits. The panel board was made by General Electric. The installed brands of breakers consisted of many GE breakers, but there were also some Murray, Cutler Hammer, Siemens, and perhaps a few others I can't remember. The result of this was the customer, the owner of the source bar, had asked me to move an ice maker. He had an old ice maker in the front of his kitchen. He wanted it relocated to the back so that he could install a new ice maker in the front that the service staff would have ready access to. And then the cook staff would have access to the other ice maker as needed, and it would also provide backup in case the front ice maker was running low on ice. The challenge ran into that when I got to that panel board and I found all these code violations, I told the owner, I cannot do what you want me to do unless I fix all these other violations. So a job that maybe should have been a few $100s ended up requiring that I had to install a sub-panel and $5,000 worth of work. So that mistake made by a previous electrical contractor, and I'm using that term loosely, cost this owner a considerable amount of money. So this so-called licensed electrical contractor, every time he was asked to come back and add another piece of equipment, add another circuit or something like that, he would choose to bypass the code requirements and come up with his own solution to how he could do this. So evidently he was running out of circuits. He'd exceeded the 42 limit capacity, which at that time was the limit. Those of us that are more familiar with the code know that that is no longer necessarily true, but there's a lot of older equipment out there, far more older equipment out there with the 42 circuit limitation than there is newer equipment. I'll go into some examples here of some of the breakers he tried to use later. I will tell you at one point when I was demonstrating the deficiencies to the owner, I touched a breaker and it fell out of my hand. So that gives you an example of how that non-GE breaker would fit in the panel, but really didn't fit. The second example, at the residence, the air conditioning mechanic had to replace a breaker in the panel board in the house. He did so with the wrong brand of breaker, in the sense that it was not the same brand as the panel board. I believe that panel board was also General Electric. The breaker that the technician installed was a Square D Homeline breaker, which physically fit in the panel. But when the homeowner called me and asked me about this installation, because he was out of town at the time, he was a little concerned, wanted to make sure that the technician had done the right thing, because here in the state of Georgia, an air conditioning contractor is allowed to do their own electrical work. I did a little bit of research to make sure I wasn't lying to him, and I told him, I said, I could find no evidence that a Square D Homeline breaker was UL listed for use as a replacement breaker in a GE or anybody else's panel board for that matter. The homeowner called the contractor as a result of our conversation and explained the situation to him, and the contractor told him, well, we do it all the time. The homeowner was going to have me come replace the breaker at additional expense. And he was able to get the air conditioning contractor to replace the breaker with the proper GE breaker at the contractor's expense. Here's some of the breakers that I found in that panel board at the sports bar. And you can see here, you can't really read it here, but this is a Krause-Heinz, which is not really available anymore. And this one is a Challenger, which is now owned by Eaton. This is a Cutler Hammer, which is now owned by Eaton. This is a Murray. These are actually two different Murray breakers, but I was showing the label on the side that you can't really see it on here. And this is one of the famous Murray double twins, I call them, where you have two-pole breakers built in one. And so you have a handle tie that gives you a 40 amp pair, another handle tie up here that gives you a 20 amp pair. And then last but not least, a Siemens breaker. And there may have, like I said, there may have been a couple others in there, I just don't remember. Well, these are some of the code violations I found. I can't possibly go through all of them. What I have mentioned, it was a 42 circuit panel board. So installing more than 42 circuits in that panel board was a violation of the listing of that panel board. None of those non-GE breakers were UL listed for use in a GE panel board. which would have been so-called classified breakers. Multiple circuit breakers fell off the bus when I touched them, because they just simply were not grabbing the bus bar as tightly as they should have. There was one other major code violation where there were 5 large TVs on a 20 amp breaker. The breaker kept tripping, so some bright individual went in and replaced that with a 30 amp breaker. Stopped the breaker from tripping. TVs stayed operating. It was very easy to trace the circuit as I just went through the false ceiling, feeling for which piece of MC cable was hot. I'm going to show you a few examples of a different type of interior, similar, it's a GE interior, that will support multiple types of breakers, and how they'll physically fit, even though they're not listed for that use. And what I have here, as part of my show and tell, this is a GE interior, and this interior is designed to hold 16 full-size breakers, or up to 32 half-size breakers. Every spot in here is capable of holding 2 half-size breakers, or somewhere between 16 and 32, however you want to configure it. A typical GE panel board will simply have this large tab here without these additional notches that help support the half-size breakers. And then some breakers will have physical restrictions on the bottom of them that will prevent you from installing them in the wrong spot. So depending on the type of bus bar you have and the brand of panel, you may be limited on where you can physically place a breaker. Although there are ingenious people that come up with ways to get around that too. So the fact that a breaker will fit, you can physically plug it in. And I can demonstrate that to you even further with some of the breakers that I have brought with me here. That does not mean that it is safe or legal to install that breaker in that panel board. This is an ITE breaker, a company that is out of business. It will physically not fit. That's a good thing. This is a Thomas & Betts. I'm not sure they're still in business doing that. It fit. Does that mean that it's legal, safe, code compliant to use this Thomas & Betts breaker in this GE panel board? Certainly not, unless this breaker has information documenting that it has been UL tested and accepted for that use. This is an oddball breaker. There's actually nothing on this breaker whatsoever to indicate who made this breaker, what company, and yet it will fit. Fortunately, it seems like the handle doesn't really work very well, so I'm not even sure that breaker works. And this is an American Switch Company breaker, another company that may be out of business. It physically fits. So 3 out of the 4 breakers I've tried here, all 4 not made by GE, will fit this panel board. And most likely they would fit any other GE panel board as well. This is again a picture of the interior. This is showing it essentially fully loaded with GE breakers. The majority of these breakers are half-size or slim breakers. There's a full-size breaker. A number of these breakers are 2-pole breakers. They will only fit in certain places on this panel board as well. Because the idea of a 2-pole breaker is that it is meant to provide 240-volt circuit. So if you could install it in the wrong space, it wouldn't work. So if I try to put this breaker in a space here that's meant for 2 twins, I would be on the same bus. Both halves of this breaker would essentially be on the B bus. And that wouldn't do me any good as far as my 240-volt equipment. So I have to install it in between, and then it will fit. And then I'm on one pole on the top screw and I'm terminal, and I'm on the other pole on the bottom terminal. So even within this panel board using a GE breaker, there are limitations on where that breaker can be installed. This is an example of where I just took some of these random types of breakers and attempted to plug them in to that interior. This breaker fit, this breaker fit, this breaker didn't. It wouldn't quite go down all the way. This 2-pole breaker fit. This is that famous double twin, Murray. It didn't fit. Here's a single pole breaker that did fit. And we keep going. Home line breaker fit. This breaker, maybe a Bryant or Murray, I think it's Murray, it looks like it may not have fit. It may have. These may. That one definitely did. That one definitely did. This one probably, nope. That one yes. That one I think no. So depending on the brands, some breakers will fit depending on the panel board. One of these breakers that didn't fit on this GE panel board might fit some other GE panel board. Still does not make it code compliant. This gives you a little better idea of what we're talking about. You can see here this breaker fully seated. That's a GE breaker. It should fully seat in a GE panel. That's 2 singles. This is a GE 2-pole breaker, and obviously, as I showed you, it will not fit when you're trying to get it on the same pole. Here's a similar GE breaker that will fit when it is on 2 poles. This is some other brand of breaker, and it will fit. And then here's another 2-pole breaker. You can see how it won't fit if you're trying to stagger across the poles sort of the way that this breaker has to. Documentation in a panel board that discusses, reveals to the installer what the listing requirements are for this piece of equipment will typically tell you what you can and cannot do. So you'll have a diagram inside the cover that will show you, yes, I can put full-size breakers in these slots. I can put full-size breakers in these slots. I could put full-size breakers or tandem or half-size breakers in these slots. But these tandem breakers or half-size breakers should not fit in these other slots, unless perhaps you're using the wrong brand. And again, this is another example of how you can have a panel board that is 40 circuits if you use twin breakers or tandem breakers in these slots. So you can have 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40 total breakers in this panel. Or you may only be able to have a fewer number depending on the construction. And in the listing also, in a different part, which you can't see as part of this diagram, but there will be something up here that will tell you 20 poles maximum. And then it tells you the limits in terms of the size of the breakers you can install depending on the type of wire that you're installing. So the listing and labeling limits a number of factors. The type of breaker you can install, because certain manufacturers make multiple types that might fit that panel, but only certain ones of those types may be UL listed for that particular application. And the location where those breakers can be installed. And the total quantity of breakers or circuits that can be installed. How do people get by some of this stuff? Not only using the wrong brand of breaker that might physically fit, but sometimes they get a little creative in terms of field modifications. Remember that breaker I showed you earlier that I could not physically get it to fit in this interior? Now I can't get this one out. Here we go. Now, I don't remember which one it was. Was it this one? This is the ITE breaker. It will not fit. Well, I see what the problem is. See, this other breaker, it has these notches on either side. So it'll slip over those tabs that are parallel to the main bus. All I have to do is take my needle nose pliers or something and chip out the bakelite case here, and I can make that fit. Another violation of the UL listing. No one is authorized to modify the equipment in the field except the manufacturer. So this tandem breaker has a metal piece in here that is designed to restrict where it can physically be installed. This standard breaker does not. Well, maybe they want to try to put this standard breaker in a space that's intended for a tandem or vice versa. So what do? They go in there and chip out the bakelite casing on this molded case breaker so they can make it fit. Conversely, this different brands here, you see a slightly different variation as I showed you with these two breakers, where the tandem breaker does not have these two slots. The standard breaker does, or vice versa, depending on the brand. So again, a little work with some pliers or a screwdriver or something, and modify the molded case to make the breaker fit. So when can you install a brand X breaker in a brand Y panel board? One of the first conditions is typically these applications are listed for replacement use only. So you're on a service call, you have a bad breaker, you need to replace that breaker, as in the case of my friend's air conditioning system. You have a couple of options depending on the make and model of the original panel. Stock the original manufacturer's breaker, or go get one if you don't have it on your truck. But a lot of people don't want to do that because it costs them time and money. That's why they do the field modifications, or they try to jam a breaker that really isn't meant to go in there into that panel board, or just use any other breaker they happen to have on their truck that might fit. The other option is you can carry a limited supply of what are called classified breakers. Now, generally speaking, you're not allowed to use classified breakers for original installations. And I haven't known an inspector that would pass one, and depending on how you want to read the code, it's not authorized. The concept there is if you buy the panel board, buy the breakers to go with it at the same time that you're at the supply house. So you don't have to come up with some sort of solution to save yourself some time and money because you made a mistake. So, the second factor would be, is the breaker, we already said, is the breaker listed for that purpose, that application, and will the authority having jurisdiction allow or approve the installation? Just because the breaker is UL listed and it fits does not necessarily mean that the AHJ that you're having to deal with is willing to approve that installation. Classified breakers are readily apparent in terms of their difference from a non-classified breaker in one major sense. You will find a stamp that is put on that breaker at the factory that says it's a classified product. Now, you may have two breakers that are identical in terms of putting them side by side, looking at them, made by the same manufacturer. One's classified and one isn't. So that would imply that the one that is classified is for replacement use, and the one that is not classified is for original equipment use, or replacement in that manufacturer's brand panel board and no one else's. And you'll also see labels like this on the side of the breaker that will say for replacement use only, not for CTL assembly. CTL is circuit total limiting. That means that you have a panel that has those types of limitations physically installed that are designed to prevent you from exceeding the total number of circuits that panel is listed for. You can check the manufacturer's websites and see what they have to say about what breakers are listed for use in their panels. Typically, if you're going to the Square D website, it's going to say you must use Square D breakers. You go to the GE website, it's going to say you must use GE breakers, and so forth. So what you may want to look at is do a web search for classified breakers or classified replacement breakers, and you'll come up with a wealth of information, a lot of blogs and so forth discussing the pros and cons of doing this. Now, there's some companies such as Eaton, Siemens is another one, that make classified breakers that are UL listed for other brands of panels. And again, as I mentioned, you may have two Eaton breakers side by side. One is classified, one isn't, and yet they physically look identical. I don't know how they tell them apart. I don't know what's different about those breakers that makes one classified and one's not. To be aware of this, Fetz, Cutler, Hammer, Challenger, Westinghouse, and Bryant over time have all ended up being owned by Eaton. Then this specific non-classified Eaton breaker is listed for use in all the panels that Eaton now owns. That does not mean that this is a classified breaker. In fact, if you look at this breaker, and I have a couple of Eaton non-classified breakers here, you will see there is nothing on this breaker to indicate that it is for classified use. There's nothing on this breaker that tells you that you can use this for replacement in somebody else's brand of panel. So this breaker may be identical to a 2-pole 20 classified Eaton breaker, but because of the way it's labeled and listed, they're not interchangeable if you're putting them in a non-Eaton panel board. And Eaton publishes a brochure, as do Siemens and some other companies, that will give you a listing of brands of their breakers that can be used in other brands of panel boards based on their UL listing. Again, they even make some that will fit Square D panel boards, although Square D will tell you that there's no other breaker than theirs that is authorized for use in their panel board. This was from a blog that I found on the internet at International Association of Electrical Inspectors Florida chapter that from 2006 that listed a summary of classified breakers and where they could be used. But again, this is for example only. This is not meant to be binding or legal document in any way, shape, or form. This is just, at that time, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, what was known. So as a summary, we've discussed breaker applications, proper breaker applications, and use of classified breakers, and why you cannot install a GE breaker in a Murray or a Siemens panel board and vice versa, and so forth. Because it will violate the listing of that panel board, it compromises the customer safety, it puts you and your business at risk, and it's a code violation. Thank you very much.